All right, friends. Today we're going to talk about social inequality, focusing on wealth inequality. Last week we talked about income inequality, and today we're going to talk about wealth inequality. For this week, you should have read I'd Rather Be Rich by Lisa Keister. You also should have read 40 Acres and a Mule by Dalton Connolly. We're going to focus in today's discussion on I'd Rather Be Rich by Lisa Keister because I think it's the most different argument from what you've heard so far. And it lends itself to inserting some facts and data that I think you'll find interesting. In last week's lecture and discussion, we focused on income, which is what people earn. We focused on how income inequality shapes social mobility. But this week we're going to focus on wealth. And as we said in the discussion boards, the difference between wealth and income is that wealth is accumulated over the lifetime and is transferable. So wealth can be inherited and it can be passed on. So Lisa Keister says that we actually understand very little about wealth. That even though wealth is very important, we actually don't know that much about it, about how people accumulate or gain wealth over their life course, and about how people move from having less wealth to having more wealth. Paradoxically, Keister argues that understanding the concept of wealth, is the key to understanding inequality. The reason Lisa Keister argues that wealth is the key to understanding inequality is because she takes a life course approach to wealth. Life course is a sociological, theoretical perspective that we haven't encountered yet, so I'm going to spend some amount of time explaining it to you in this slide and the next slide. The life course approach, life course here is rendered as one word deliberately. You could also see it written as life course, separate words. It's a theoretical choice to write it as one word. So Lisa Keister takes the life course approach, and the life course approach focuses on over the entire life of a person. How do different things that happen along the way change the trajectory of your life? That is, how does your starting point and changes that occur throughout your life journey affect how your life turns out? We're going to talk more about that in the next slide. So this is just a visualization of the life course perspective. You can imagine that each one of us starts out at a certain point. Here we'll focus on a certain amount of wealth. Each one of us starts out with whatever wealth status our parents have. We effectively have the wealth that our parents have accumulated. That's our starting point. But we may tend to think that a person's starting point directly shapes their outcomes. That's more or less what we discussed in the last lecture, and to some large degree that's true. Where you start out largely affects how you end up. But there are also what I call here inflection points. Other people might call them intervening variables or changes or some other concept, but what I've called inflection points along the way. What this means are you don't have a smooth, obvious path from where you start to where you end up. Things happen along the way. Things happen throughout your life that would tend to change the course of your life from start to outcome. We get the idea of trajectory from an arrow. Imagine an arrow shooting from a bow. How the arrow is launched from the bow is going to tend to predict where the arrow lands. But things like the wind, or an object hitting the arrow, or something else could could knock the arrow off course or into a different path. So that's what these inflection points are. There are things that happen in our life that tend to nudge that path from starting point to outcome. So you could imagine a person starting out in a wealthy family, and then when they are 16, their parents cut them off because of bad life choices that they've made. That would tend to disrupt the path from their starting point of wealth to the predicted wealthy outcome. Alternatively, you can imagine someone starting out rather poor, with poor parents, and then in their early teens, their parents win the lottery, giving them millions of dollars that they can then use to get a good college education, perhaps start a small business, and that would tend to change their trajectory. So the life course approach focuses on how all of these inflection points interact to shape our outcomes from our starting point. An important example of applying a life course approach to wealth is the idea of inheritance versus inter vivos transfers of wealth. Inheritance is money that someone receives when someone else dies, where inter vivos transfers are gifts of money made within the giver's lifetime. So what this looks like in practice is the difference between getting money when a grandparent or a parent dies versus getting money to help you with something when you're an adult but your parent or grandparent is still alive. So we're going to look at some patterns of how that works and how it affects wealth outcomes over the life course. So these charts come from a study done in 2018 by the Federal Reserve. And what it shows is the probability of receiving an inheritance and the amount of inheritance received over the life course divided by income group. So to orient you to the chart, if you look at the left-hand panel, the figure on the left, and you look at the y-axis, the numbers going up and down on the left side of the chart, you see that what it's showing is a probability of receiving an inheritance. At the bottom, you have 0. There's a 0% chance of receiving an inheritance. And at the top is 0.1, meaning there's a 10% chance of receiving an inheritance. So what this chart is showing us is the probability of receiving an inheritance. And then if you look at the or the x-axis across the bottom of the chart, it's showing the age of the recipient of the transfer of wealth, or of the inheritance. So what it's showing is at any given age, what is your probability of receiving an inheritance? And what we see is that for people in their 20s, in the bottom 50% of incomes, there's about a 2% chance that you're going to receive an inheritance in your 20s. Whereas for people in the top 10% of incomes, there's about a 55-60% chance you're going to receive an income in your 20s. For all groups, all income groups, your probability of getting an inheritance peaks when you're in your 60s and then declines from there. So what I want you to take away from this chart is that you're the most likely to get an inheritance when you're in your 60s. If you're in the top 10% of incomes, you have about a 10% chance of receiving an inheritance in your 60s. If you're in the bottom 50% of incomes, you have about a 4% chance of getting an inheritance in your 60s. But that's when you're the most likely to get an inheritance. Then if you look at the panel on the right, you see that the x-axis is the same. Going across the bottom, you see ages of the recipient. But going up the y-axis this time, you see thousands of 2016 dollars. So this is how much inheritance someone receives on average. So what we see, and the colored lines mean the same thing they did in the last panel. So what we see is that for people in the bottom 50% of earners, they tend to receive about $100,000 of inheritance. And for people in the top 1%, they tend to receive around $400,000 to $500,000 in inheritance. So that's a big difference. But again, for all brackets of income, we see that they're most likely to get that money in their 60s. Now, these charts are formatted in exactly the same way, and they show the same kind of information. The difference is that instead of looking at inheritances, now we're looking at transfers of wealth that occur within someone's lifetime. That is, an example of what these charts show would be your parents giving you money for college, or your parents giving you money to put a down payment on your first house, or your parents giving you money to start a business. So if you look at the left-hand panel, you see that again, the y-axis represents a probability. And here, the probability is much smaller. We move from 0% chance at the bottom to only a 2% chance at the top. And then across the x-axis, again, we have the age of the recipient. So what this chart is showing is how likely are you to get a gift of money from your parents or grandparents or another relative when you're in each of these age groups. And we see here that for all income groups, the probability of getting an inter vivos transfer of wealth, that is a gift of money from a living relative, peaks when you're in your 20s and then declines steadily from there. So what we can envision happening here is a parent helping a young adult child get started in life. And we see that the probability of this happening is 2% for people in the top 10% of income in any given year, and about 1.5% for anyone else, or for people in the bottom 50% of incomes. Now, if you look at the amount of gift that's being given, we see that it tends to increase slightly from about $300,000 in your 20s to about $400,000 when you're older. This could be because parents are nearing the end of their lives and are choosing to give inheritance as a gift before they die. This is an especially popular choice for top earners, as they may wish to avoid inheritance taxes. But what we see is that for people who are in the bottom 90% of incomes, they're getting between $1 and $200,000, or between $50,000 and $200,000 in wealth at any point in their lives, where the amount is higher for people in the top 10%. They tend to get between $300,000 in their 20s to about $400,000 in their 60s. Now remember, what we said about the life course is that these transfers of wealth at different points in your life would actually affect your outcomes, that they would shape the trajectory of the rest of your life. So what this looks like is, imagine having your college paid for entirely by your parents. This allows you to get started in life debt-free. Or imagine if your parents were to give you the down payment for your first house. This would allow you to invest in real estate early in life, which would increase your wealth moving forward. So what I want to show you, this is from the same 2016 study done by the Fed. And what it shows is the outcome of these transfers of wealth. So the top row of this table shows what share of wealth is owned by each percentile of the population. So here we see what we've heard before. The top 10% of all households own 72% of all wealth. The next 40% own 25% of all the wealth. So that has 97% of wealth being owned by the top 50%, and the bottom 50% of all households owning 3% of all the wealth. So what they've done in the bottom part of this chart is show what fraction of wealth that's owned by each of these or each of these household groupings is explained by inter vivos transfers of wealth. That is, gifts of wealth made to you by a relative during their lifetime. So what we see is that if you pay attention to the second column from the right, what we see is that if we estimate a steady interest rate of 3% on investments, the top 10% of households in terms of wealth, 25% of their wealth comes from transfers made during their parents' or grandparents' lifetimes. So those gifts that your parents give you earlier in your life, mainly in your 20s through 40s, could explain up to 25% of your wealth, even if we assume that return on investment is pretty low. And for the lower income brackets or lower wealth brackets, we see that the return or the proportion of wealth owned could be even higher. So for the bottom 50% of households, 43% of their wealth could be explained by inter vivos transfers. Now remember, that's very little wealth, and those transfers are small, but those transfers could explain a much bigger share of all the wealth that they own. And if we look at the bottom row here, this is just assuming that return on investment is very high at 5%. If return on investment is high, then 53% of all wealth owned by the top 10% of households could be explained by these transfers, and 74% for the bottom earners. So Keister asks an important question that we need to consider when we talk about inequality in general. So far in this course, we've just assumed that the rich are better off than the poor. Keister actually presents this as a question and sets forth to answer it. She asks, are the rich actually better off? And then she says, yes, the rich are, just as we might expect, definitely better off. And then she outlines several ways in which the wealthy are better off than those who are less wealthy. The most obvious, perhaps, way in which the wealthy are better off is in terms of quality of life. If you're wealthy, you can afford not just more things, but the kinds of things that make your life feel better every day. You can afford to take breaks from work when you need to. You can afford to live in a neighborhood that feels safe and comfortable. You can afford to get health care when you're ill. You can afford to have security. You can afford to have comfort. You can afford to have hobbies. You can afford to travel. You can afford to do things that make your day-to-day life feel nicer. And having these kinds of things like safety, security, exercise, hobbies, relaxation, socializing actually make you healthier and better off in terms of your well-being in your body. So we talked about very early in the semester that the wealthy actually have fewer days of disability every year. That is, fewer days when they're sick or injured or out of work because of ill health. The wealthy also live longer. People who are wealthy live 7 to 15 years on average longer than the poor. So your quality of life is much better. Another benefit Keister says comes from being wealthy is ability to weather emergencies. If an emergency happens and you're living paycheck to paycheck, something as minor as missing a week of work because you're really sick could be catastrophic. Whereas if you have a lot of savings, or even if you can count on inter vivos transfers of wealth from family to help you, um, having an emergency may not be such a crisis. For example, when my husband and I were in our early 20s, he got a new job that was going to pay enough money for us to live just fine, but they held his first paycheck. They didn't pay him for the first month, and rent came due while they were still holding his first paycheck. Uh, I didn't have enough money to make rent on my own, and we didn't have enough money in the bank to make rent. But I was able to call my parents and get an interest free loan of the amount. Um, so until they paid my husband his first paycheck, we were able to make rent and avoid eviction. If I had come from a less wealthy family, however, we would have been evicted and our credit would have been destroyed and we would have had an eviction on our credit report. So it would have been a lot more dangerous for us to have had a paycheck held, which is not even considered an emergency. It's just kind of a thing that happens sometimes. But that would have been a crisis for us had I not had a wealthy family. Another way in which Keister says the wealthy are better off is with political and social influence. So, Weber talked about the fact that the wealthy can monopolize opportunity in part through state power, in part through political party and state power, and that they can actually affect the law of the land. So, for the very wealthy, that's a reality. They can, in effect, contribute to political campaigns, contribute to fundraising efforts, and directly influence political outcomes. However, the wealthier in general have more social influence than the poor. They have access to social networks, what Weber would have called status. They have availability of social networks, which they can use to influence social outcomes and make their social lives better. So, in sum, Keister says yes, by any metric you care to point out, the rich are better off than the poor. And this is a primary reason she says we should care about wealth and about wealth inequality. So, another question Keister asks in her article is, why is wealth so appealing? And why do we fixate on the wealthy and on what wealth is? If the bottom 50% of all earners own 3% of the wealth, then why should we care about the wealthy and what wealth is like? We don't have it. And Keister says that's precisely the reason we do care. We care about wealth because it's mysterious. We've always, as Americans, been fascinated by the wealthy, by their lifestyles, by their strategies, by their behavior, because precisely they seem so far removed from us. Their realities are so different from our own. So Keister says, we're fascinated by wealth because it's mysterious. She also says we're fascinated by wealth because we see wealth growing. There's more and more wealth all around us. Even in times of economic recession, gross domestic product, that is the amount of wealth that exists in our country, is rising. And total household wealth is rising. However, at the same time, wealth distribution is increasingly unequal. At the same time that we're seeing more and more wealth exist in our society, we're seeing it become distributed in more and more uneven ways. The next few charts are going to demonstrate that concept. This chart, which comes from data collected by the Congressional Budget Office in 2013, shows the total holdings of family wealth in the United States in trillions of 2013 dollars. So again, we've broken this out by percent of households. So the lightest purple area here is the top 10% of households in terms of wealth. And then the purple area, the kind of violet area in the middle, is the 51st to 90th percentiles. So basically, the top 50% minus the very top 10%. And then this black area at the bottom that you can kind of barely see is the bottom 50% of all households. So what we see here is that before the 2008-2009 recession, household wealth peaked for the top 10% at about $75 trillion. It then dipped to about $65 trillion after the recession, and is now rebounding to about $70 trillion in 2013. For the 51st to 90th percentile, so that top 50% except for the top 10%, we see that it peaked at around $15 trillion before the last recession, and then leveled off to right around $12 trillion. And then for the bottom 50%, we see that it kind of peaked, like if you can say that's a peak. It kind of peaked right before the recession at about $1 trillion, and is now less than $1 trillion. So we see that GDP, that is holdings of family wealth, total, have been rising, and despite the dip in the last recession, they're rebounding. They're rising again. But we see that whereas in 1989, the number was much lower, but the distribution was slightly more equitable. We see that since 1989, the total amount of wealth has increased greatly, but mostly for that top 10%. So here we can see pretty much the same information, just presented in a different format. We have a line chart instead of a figure. And what this is showing is the percentage of wealth, of all household wealth, owned by each wealth grouping. So here we see that in 1989, the top 1% of all households in terms of wealth, represented by this blue line, owned 30% of all the wealth. The next 9% owned about 37%. And the bottom 90% owned about 33% of all the wealth. It was really fairly evenly distributed. Then we see what's happened since then. The top 1% has pretty steadily increased to owning almost 40% of all the wealth. That's the top 1% of all households. The next 9%, so the top 10% minus that top 1%, owns an additional 40% of the wealth, meaning that together they own about 75 to 80% of all the wealth. And then we can see what's happened to the bottom 90% of all households, represented by the purple line. It's just dropped off sharply, especially since the last recession. They went from owning about 30% of all household wealth in 2004 all the way down to owning just about 22, 23% in 2016. So that's the bottom 90% of all households. So we see that wealth is indeed growing, but it's really only growing for the top 10%. For the bottom 90%, it's just plummeting. So in addition to the total amount of wealth that people own changing, the kinds of things they own and the kinds of things they owe are changing too. So if wealth is what you own and debt is what you owe, then the kinds of things we own that provide wealth and the kinds of things we owe on that compose our debt are changing. For example, home ownership, which is a major source of wealth for most Americans, has decreased. Most American wealth is in the form of owning a home. And in recent decades, the share of Americans who own their home has gotten smaller. However, the kinds of things we owe on have changed as well. So for most of American history, your home loan was your main source of debt. Increasingly, while that's still true, increasingly student debt and medical debt are larger and larger shares of what people owe on, especially for lower income families. So this chart, which comes from the United States Census Bureau, shows us what proportion of Americans own the home that they live in. And we see that home ownership really peaked right before the housing market crash in 2007, where almost 70% of Americans owned the home they lived in, meaning about 30% were renters. And we've seen that shift drastically, such that in 2016, 63% of Americans owned the home they lived in, and about 37% were renters. And that changed a little bit in 2018. We're going back up to 65%. But you can see we still have a much larger share of renters than we did before the housing market crash. So this chart from the New York Fed shows us how consumer debt has changed. The first point, the point this chart is trying to make, is that Americans actually owe more than we did before the last recession. So you can see the last recession shaded here in gray. And you see that we owed roughly $12 trillion in debt as a nation before that crash. Whereas now we owe up to 14 trillion. But what I want to point out is that the share of debt made up by different categories has changed. So the light blue on the bottom that makes up the largest share of all debt is mortgages. And the tiny green bar above that is home equity revolving credit. So that's money you borrow against the value of your house. And it's been a pretty steady share of debt for a while. Auto loan debt has increased in red, as has credit card debt in orange, although that's remained fairly stable. But the most obviously expanding source of debt is student loan debt, which from the last recession to 2019 has almost tripled. So the share of debt composed of student loan debt has just gotten out of control. And other, which would include medical debt, which would include private loans or payday lending, has remained about the same. So this chart shows the breakdown of debt composition by net worth. It's pretty difficult to read, so we're going to spend a great amount of time reading through it together. I want you to look at the y-axis on the left side of this chart, the numbers going up and down the left side. And you notice that the numbers represent percentage. So at the bottom is 0%, and at the top is 100%. So what these bars are showing is what percent of a household's debt is composed of each category of debt. Now, if you look along the x-axis at the bottom of the chart, you see that the first column, the first bar, represents non-negative wealth. That means people who own more than they owe. Negative wealth means you owe more than you own. So you can think of this left-hand column, this left-hand pillar, as representing all Americans who own more wealth than they owe debt. People with positive net worth. The next three columns on the right are divided by terciles of negative net worth. Tercile just means third, the same way quintile means fifth. So groups of negative net worth. So the first column, the second from the left, of negative net worth, represents people who owe between like $0.009 and people who owe $12.4 thousand. So the next column, the middle one of negative net worth, are people who owe between $12,500 and $46.3 thousand. And so then the column on the right are the poorest Americans, those who owe between $47.5 thousand and $520,000. So those who are the most in debt. So you can think of these bars as going from those who actually own money on the left to those who are the very most indebted on the right. So the colored bars within each column represent types of debt. So for those with non-negative wealth, you see that this pink bar at the top represents no debt. This is the proportion of their income that's represented by positive wealth, or proportion of their budget that's represented by positive wealth. You can see that for the wealthy, for those who own any wealth at all, housing loans are the major source of debt. That dark blue bar at the bottom is their biggest source of debt, followed by credit card debt, and then auto loans. So those are the biggest shares of debt they have. We see that for the first tercile of negative net worth, that is those who owe between $9 and $12.4 thousand, credit card debt is by far the biggest share of their debt, followed by auto loans. But we see that student loans are starting to make up a significant proportion of their debt, as are medical bills. Medical bills is that kind of medium blue bar second from the top. If you look at the group in the middle, owing between $12.5 and $46.3 thousand in debt, you see that student loans are by far the biggest share of their debt. They don't owe a lot on credit cards. They don't owe a lot on their mortgage. They have some medical bills and some auto loan bills, yes. But by far the biggest thing they owe on is education. And then if you look at the very most indebted Americans, you see that medical bills are a much smaller share of their debt, probably because Americans who have this little net worth actually qualify for Medicaid benefits. So they get state-sponsored insurance, so that their medical bills are probably much smaller. But again, the biggest share of debt that they owe is education. Education is eating up most of what they owe. It's the single biggest thing they owe on, more than mortgages, more than credit cards, more than auto loans, more than any other type of debt. So what I'd like you to take away from looking at this chart is that people tend to say that people go into debt and owe a lot of debt based mostly on poor financial choices, that they make poor investments, that they buy things they can't afford. But if you look at the shares of debt, if you look at the debt composition, you see that the poorest Americans are spending most of their money on housing and on education, and that credit card and auto loans, they actually owe less than every other category of Americans on credit cards and auto loans. So they're not charging up credit cards buying luxury goods they can't afford. They're investing in housing and education. So, given everything we've talked about, I'd like you to consider the following discussion questions. I want you to consider how wealth affects a person's life course, including how getting money at different stages of your life course might affect you differently. I'd like you to consider how wealth shapes a person's life chances. What kinds of opportunities do you have if you're wealthy that you might not have if you're less wealthy? And how does wealth impact a person's ability to cope with life's uncertainties, to weather emergencies, for example? I'd also like you to engage with some of Keister's assertions. For example, Keister says that wealth impacts a person's quality of life, that the wealthy have better lives than the poor. I would like you to talk about whether and why that might be true. I'd also like you to talk about how understanding wealth helps us to understand inequality. Finally, I'd like you to consider, given the trends we've seen in wealth inequality, what do you think will happen in the future? Do you think the wealth gap is going to continue increasing? Or do you think it's going to decrease? And why or why not?